Hey guys, tonight we wander down the crowded, sun-baked streets of ancient Rome, where sandals slap on the stone, olives are hawked from baskets, and in nearly every doorway stands someone who is not free. Imagine yourself drifting through that world, every shout from a vendor, every smell of roasting bread, every creak of a cartwheel, it's all powered by a vast, invisible engine of enslaved labor. And yes, before you get too cozy in your modern chair, remember that if you actually landed here, you'd probably be enslaved yourself within a week. Not the best vacation package, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It always fascinates me how this little journey stretches across so many time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle down the Via Sacra, the main artery of the Roman Forum, and see slaves everywhere, carrying water jugs, cleaning sandals, following behind their masters like shadows. In Rome, slavery isn't rare, it's the backbone of society. Historians estimate that 1 in 3 people in Italy during the late Republic may have been enslaved. Some were born into servitude, others captured in war. Still others sold because of crushing debt. Unlike the racialized slavery of more modern times, here anyone could become a slave: Greek, Syrian, Celt, Thracian, Jew. If you lost a battle, you lost your freedom. It's disorienting to realize how normal it all feels in this world. A wealthy senator might own hundreds of slaves across his estates, while an ordinary shopkeeper might scrimp together enough to buy just one assistant. There's even a joke from the satirist Juvenal: if you can't afford a slave, you're forced to pour your own wine. Imagine the horror. But slavery in Rome isn't a single experience. You could be chained in a stone quarry, sweating under the Mediterranean sun until your back cracks, or you could be a secretary taking dictation for Cicero, nibbling olives in his villa. Some slaves became doctors, teachers, accountants. The jobs depended more on your skills than your birth. Yet no matter how cushy the role, your legal status was the same: you were property, not a person. That property status brings us to tonight's theme: what owners could, and could not, do. Because while masters boasted nearly unlimited power, Roman law, custom, and religion did place a few surprising guardrails. Tiny ones, maybe, but enough to spark debates among ancient jurists and modern historians alike. You step into a domus, a wealthy Roman townhouse. In the atrium, sunlight streams down from the opening in the roof, glinting off a shallow pool that collects rainwater. Slaves glide silently through the halls, carrying towels, bringing wine, setting out bronze lamps. You feel the hum of a machine, everyone in motion to make a single man's day run smoothly, yet beneath that smooth surface lies tension. Roman writers often described slaves as potential threats, silent watchers who knew their master's secrets, who might poison his wine or whisper to his rivals. Owners feared rebellion, and not without reason. Remember Spartacus? That gladiator who led a massive slave uprising in 73 BCE terrified the Republic so badly that the Senate lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crucified bodies as a warning. Still, most slaves did not rebel. They lived, worked, and adapted, finding small pockets of autonomy where they could. Some managed their own savings, others struck deals, a few even earned eventual freedom. But the rules of this world are slippery. You, standing there in your sandals, notice that masters often blur the line between family and property, allowing slaves to raise children, to worship household gods, even to manage parts of the estate. And yet, legally, every heartbeat still belonged to someone else. One mainstream fact you can't ignore: Roman law defined slaves as res, things. They could be bought, sold, punished, or inherited like furniture. But here comes a quirky tidbit: slaves could technically own other slaves. Well, not legally own them, since they weren't people in the eyes of the law, but through something called a peculium, a sort of savings account managed with their master's permission. One slave could control another. Picture a human Russian nesting doll of ownership, where each layer is still ultimately owned by the same master at the top. Historians still argue whether Romans ever truly believed slaves were human beings in a moral sense, or whether they treated humanity and property as completely separate categories. On one hand, the philosopher Seneca scolded his fellow elites for beating their slaves at dinner, reminding them that they are men, just like you. On the other hand, the same Seneca kept slaves himself and probably never set them free. Walking deeper into this household, you notice how invisible boundaries form. A slave might be trusted to handle money but forbidden from sitting at the table. Another might raise the master's children but be sold without notice. And yet, despite this crushing inequality, some rules nudged masters to restrain their impulses. They couldn't do absolutely anything. That's what will unravel as you drift further into these marble halls, hearing the shuffle of sandals and the clink of amphorae in the shadows. You linger in that Roman townhouse, the mosaic floors cool under your feet, and you notice something curious. Although the master struts about with near absolute authority, there are whispers of rules that hold him back. Roman law, for all its stern Latin phrasing, sometimes stepped in to tell owners what they could not do to their slaves. Imagine trying to boss around a lamp. You can smash it if you want, but then the government comes along and says, well, actually, not that way. That's how Romans balanced property rights with social order. You watch as a slave girl hurries past with a basket of figs. She looks down, not daring to meet your eyes. Her master can discipline her, yes. But he cannot, at least in theory, mutilate her without cause. Roman jurists wrote that slaves were property, yet they still had a body, and damaging that body could lower market value. In other words, laws protected slaves not out of kindness, but because their owners had investments to preserve. Imagine the ancient version of AppleCare. You can drop your iPhone, but smash it on purpose, and the shopkeeper gets annoyed. One mainstream fact here: by the reign of Emperor Augustus, there were statutes limiting outright sadism. A master couldn't just kill a slave in cold blood without some kind of justification. Laws like the Lex Patronia, dating from around the 1st century CE, required a magistrate's approval before throwing a slave into the arena with wild beasts. Picture needing paperwork before feeding your slave to a lion. Bureaucracy, Rome's real superpower. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that makes you tilt your head. There were certain public offices where slaves could not be used, even if owners wanted to. For example, you couldn't install a slave as a city magistrate, though honestly, who would want to? Imagine explaining zoning laws while also carrying your master's groceries. Still, it shows the Romans occasionally drew lines in strange places. As you glide into the atrium again, you hear masters gossiping about punishments. They may beat, they may confine, but if they go too far, neighbors could complain. Roman society cared deeply about appearances. If your punishments looked excessive, you risked being seen as cruel and un-Roman. And yes, in a culture famous for gladiatorial bloodbaths, being too cruel was a thing. You pause by a statue of a household god, the Lares. A slave kneels there, lighting incense. Religion, too, placed invisible guardrails on ownership. Some masters believed angering the gods by mistreating slaves invited bad fortune. After all, if the household spirits saw you abusing your servants, would they bless your dinner party? Maybe not. Historians still argue whether these so-called protections were sincere humanitarian gestures or just pragmatic rules to keep households running smoothly. Was Rome inching toward recognizing slaves as people, or just covering its own economic backside? The debates echo like footsteps down the marble halls, unanswered. You overhear another restriction: owners could not order a slave to commit a crime for them, at least not without risk. Sure, plenty did, sending slaves to steal, forge, or spy, but the law could technically hold the master accountable. It's the ancient equivalent of saying, you can't just hand your butler a ski mask and tell him to rob the bakery. But enforcement was patchy. If you were rich and powerful, rules bent around you like reeds in the wind. A poor craftsman who mistreated his single slave might get hauled before a magistrate. A senator? He'd likely stroll away untouched. Still, these technical limits existed, carved into Roman legal texts like faint pencil lines beneath a fresco. As evening lamps flicker to life in the villa, you picture how these rules shaped daily life. A master wanted obedience but also had to keep slaves alive, somewhat healthy, and not too demoralized. Why? Because hopeless slaves ran away, poisoned food, or whispered rebellion. Laws that told owners no, you can't do everything weren't so much moral breaks as social insurance, and so, as you drift off to the murmur of fountains and the glow of oil lamps, you start to sense a pattern. The Romans wrapped slavery in the language of property, but the messy realities of human lives kept poking holes in the system. These holes, thin, fragile, but real, would only widen as centuries passed. You step outside into the Roman street again, warm dust rising around your sandals, and you hear the echo of an older world, back when masters truly did hold life and death power over their slaves. The Latin phrase vitae nescisque potestas rolls off the tongue with a certain menace. It means the power of life and death. In the early Republic, a Roman father had this authority over his children, and a Roman master had it over his slaves. If he decided a servant had annoyed him, he could, at least in theory, order an execution on the spot, but the empire didn't stay frozen in that brutal mold. You drift through time, noticing how slowly, awkwardly, the sharp edges of that power began to dull. By the 1st century CE, stories circulated about masters who killed slaves without cause, and the gossip turned ugly. Neighbors complained, philosophers wagged their fingers, and even the Senate sometimes took notice. One mainstream fact stands out: Emperor Hadrian, yes, the same guy who built the famous wall up in Britain, formally restricted a master's right to kill his slaves. He decreed that anyone who murdered a slave without just reason could face punishment. Now, before you cheer too loudly, just reason was doing some heavy lifting there. Owners could still argue that theft, betrayal, or disobedience justified lethal punishment. But symbolically, something had shifted. The master was no longer untouchable. As you walk along the Tiber's edge, listening to the river lap against its banks, you recall a chilling story about the wealthy senator Vettius Pollio. He allegedly kept a pool of lampreys, those eel-like fish with the personality of a vacuum cleaner, and threatened to toss slaves in as punishment. When Emperor Augustus once dined at his villa, a slave broke a cup. Pollio ordered him fed to the lampreys. Augustus intervened, broke the rest of the cups on purpose, and spared the boy. Whether the tale is true or embellished, it circulated widely, teaching Romans that unchecked cruelty could be scandalous, even to emperors. Now for a quirky tidbit, some Roman jurists argued that killing a slave without cause was a crime not because the slave's life mattered, but because it destroyed valuable property that might otherwise belong to the heir. Imagine smashing a Ferrari you don't technically own yet. The outrage isn't moral, it's financial. Historians still argue whether the legal limits Hadrian and later emperors imposed were actually enforced or just noble-sounding edicts. After all, it's one thing to declare, no killing slaves without reason, and another to drag a powerful senator into court for doing it. The evidence is fuzzy, leaving scholars to bicker over whether these reforms truly protected slaves or simply polished Rome's self-image. As twilight falls, you wander past the flicker of torches outside a tavern, listening to gossip about punishment. Some masters executed slaves publicly to terrify others, but even here, boundaries crept in. By the 2nd century CE, Roman law required trials for certain capital punishments. Slaves accused of plotting against their masters might be tortured, yes, but the decision to execute could no longer rest solely on one man's whim. Bureaucracy again stepped in, wrapping its toga around private cruelty. You glance at the faces of slaves hurrying past, one carrying amphorae of wine, another leading children home. They live with the constant knowledge that a master's anger could end them. Yet they also hear rumors of emperors clipping wings, of philosophers speaking out, of moments where power faltered. Those rumors, faint as they were, mattered. They suggested that even in Rome's harsh world, absolute dominion was crumbling at the edges, and so, as you drift deeper into the evening, the torches glowing softer now, you realize the terrifying simplicity of early Rome. Life and death in a master's hand was being replaced by something more complex. Still dangerous, still unjust, but no longer unlimited. The grip was loosening, one decree, one scandal, one whispered story at a time. You find yourself drawn toward the marble steps of a temple, its columns glowing in the pale moonlight. The scent of incense curls into the air, mingling with the faint bleat of a goat being led for sacrifice. Temples in Rome weren't just for prayers and politics, they doubled as sanctuaries, and for slaves, that could mean a desperate chance at survival. If your master had become too brutal, you might sprint here, fling yourself at the altar, and cling to the statue of the god like your life depended on it, because it literally did. The rule was simple in theory: sacred spaces were off limits. A master could not just storm in and drag a trembling slave off the altar. Priests were supposed to intervene, questioning why the runaway had sought refuge. It was embarrassing, really. Imagine trying to scold your dishwasher in front of the local priest while Jupiter's big marble eyes stare you down. Some priests might even insist on mediating, demanding the master promise fair treatment before the slave could be returned. Here's a mainstream fact: the practice of sanctuary existed across the Roman world, inherited from older Mediterranean customs. Temples were seen as extensions of divine power, and dragging someone away by force risked offending not just the community, but the gods themselves. And Romans, superstitious to their sandals, didn't like angering their gods. A quirky tidbit makes the picture even stranger: sometimes slaves didn't just grab the altar but literally tied themselves to it with cords or chains, as if stapling themselves to holiness. The message was clear: you'll have to wrestle me and the gods together. It must have been quite the scene: a terrified house slave, still in kitchen rags, wrapped around Apollo's marble legs while incense smoke drifted lazily upward. Historians still argue whether sanctuary truly protected slaves in the long term, or whether it was just a dramatic pause button. Many scholars suspect that priests often sent slaves back home after a stern lecture to the master. Others suggest sanctuary occasionally worked, forcing owners to sell the slave to someone else instead of keeping them. The sources are thin, leaving us to imagine tense standoffs beneath temple roofs. You walk further into the temple precinct, cool marble underfoot, and imagine the whisper of slaves' prayers echoing between columns. Sanctuary wasn't just about survival, it was also a social weapon. A slave who fled to a temple could publicly shame his master, turning private cruelty into a communal spectacle. And in a society obsessed with honor and appearances, that sting sometimes hurt worse than the loss of labor. You linger near the altar, picturing how the ritual unfolded: the runaway trembling, the priests demanding explanations, the master forced to stand red-faced in public. Did the gods side with the slave? Or did they simply remind the master to keep cruelty behind closed doors where neighbors couldn't gossip? The answer depends on whose scroll you read. By the time you leave the temple, the night air feels cooler, the stars brighter above Rome's rooftops. The sanctuary rule didn't end slavery, didn't even guarantee protection. But it carved out one of those odd exceptions where a powerless person could, for a moment, wrap themselves in divine authority. It was a reminder that even in Rome, where men bragged about owning other men, there were places where the whip had to stop at the temple door. You wander from the temple steps back into the narrow lanes of Rome, where laundry flaps between balconies and the hum of daily life never quite fades. Somewhere nearby, a whip cracks against stone, not flesh. It's being tested, flexed in the air. That sharp sound reminds you of one of the most common punishments a slave might face: flogging. The lash was a regular part of Roman discipline, almost casual in its familiarity. And yet, even here, limits started creeping in. A mainstream fact to anchor you: the Lex Patronia, that law we brushed against earlier, wasn't just about beasts in the arena. It reflected a broader unease about unrestrained cruelty. By the 1st century CE, jurists were debating how far whipping could go. Owners could flog, yes, but not necessarily to the point of permanent injury or death. The law, in its strange Roman logic, sought to keep punishments proportional. Which sounds noble, until you realize that proportional still meant bloodied backs and torn skin, but here comes a quirky tidbit. Some households used elaborate whipping devices that look today more like bizarre gym equipment. Ancient graffiti and descriptions mention wooden frames where slaves could be tied spread eagle for lashes, or even contraptions resembling a rotating wheel. And here's the kicker, some Romans worried less about the pain and more about whether the punishment was aesthetically appropriate. A nobleman didn't want his guests to see a slave's back so scarred it spoiled the symmetry of the household staff. Think of it as cruelty with a brand manager. Historians still argue whether emperors like Hadrian or Antoninus Pius genuinely tried to reduce flogging or just wanted punishments carried out more discreetly. Some edicts insisted that owners avoid public humiliation, suggesting that what mattered was not the suffering itself, but whether neighbors rolled their eyes at the spectacle. After all, Rome was obsessed with appearances, and messy cruelty could be bad PR. You follow the sound of that whip into a courtyard. A group of slaves huddle together, whispering. They know that while the lash was legal, their master sometimes overstepped. A drunken beating could kill, and then suddenly, because of those laws, the master found himself under scrutiny. So many owners walked a tightrope. They wanted obedience, but too much blood risked legal trouble or neighborhood outrage. And here's an odd little reminder. In some estates, slaves actually carried whips themselves. They acted as overseers, punishing other slaves under orders. Imagine being beaten by someone just as unfree as you. A coworker turned enforcer. The lash was not just a tool of pain but of division, keeping slaves from uniting. As twilight deepens, you lean against a wall and imagine the sounds echoing through Roman streets, laughter spilling from taverns, dice rattling on wooden tables, and somewhere, behind closed doors, the dull rhythm of lashes. Yet you also remember those invisible boundaries. A master could punish, but not always to the point of ruin. Laws, customs, even superstition tangled around the whip, softening its edge just enough to remind masters they weren't gods. You step away, the echo of leather still humming in your ears, and realize the irony. Rome tried to regulate pain like one might regulate a noisy cart or an overflowing gutter. Not too much, not too public, not too messy. Cruelty was allowed, but carefully measured, as though the empire prided itself on tidying up even its brutality. You drift into the quieter side streets, where oil lamps cast soft halos against stucco walls, and you overhear a different kind of murmur, two slaves whispering vows to one another in a shadowed corner of a courtyard. They clasp hands, heads bowed, promising to stay together. There's no priest, no official contract, nothing the Roman state would recognize as a marriage. And yet, for them, it matters. Romans even had a word for this unofficial union, contubernium, which literally means sharing a tent. Here's the strange truth. Roman law didn't allow slaves to marry in the legal sense. They were property, and property can't sign contracts. But owners often permitted these pairings because they created stability, loyalty, and, of course, children, new little slaves born into the household. Still, certain boundaries meant masters couldn't do anything they pleased. If two slaves lived in a long-standing contubernium, ripping them apart arbitrarily could draw frowns, legal complaints, or even trouble with magistrates. A mainstream fact, under the Antonine emperors in the 2nd century CE, jurists began noting that slave families had a sort of quasi-recognition. They weren't marriages, but they weren't entirely invisible either. If a master repeatedly broke apart such unions without cause, he risked looking abusive. And remember, Rome cared deeply about public reputation. Now a quirky tidbit, inscriptions have been found where freedmen, former slaves, proudly recorded their years spent with a partner since the days of servitude. Some even marked anniversaries, counting back to the moment when two slaves first declared themselves bound, long before freedom gave them legal standing. Imagine carving into stone, together since 20 BCE, even when we were technically furniture. Historians still argue whether masters truly respected slave partnerships or just tolerated them for convenience. Some scholars point to touching epitaphs that suggest real affection survived, even flourished, under slavery. Others argue that owners merely exploited these unions to breed more household labor. The debate hums in the background, unresolved, like the faint strum of a lyre drifting out of a tavern. As you watch the couple in the courtyard, you picture the risks they face. A master might sell one partner to a farm in Sicily, another to a brothel in Pompeii, scattering their vows to the wind. Yet, sometimes, limits applied. Certain contracts or wills included clauses not to separate families. And in the sanctuary of temples, priests occasionally intervened, urging masters to respect these bonds. It's bittersweet, isn't it? The slaves cling to each other beneath the olive trees, knowing their promises might vanish with a single transaction. But the very existence of such promises reveals something the law couldn't fully smother: the stubborn human need to love, to bind, to resist erasure. So you walk on, leaving them in their whispered embrace, and realize that even Rome's iron grip loosened when it came to these fragile unions. Owners might pretend love didn't exist in their ledgers, but love existed anyway, messy, inconvenient, and occasionally strong enough to bend the rules. The next morning you wander through the bustling clamor of a Roman marketplace, where the air smells of sweat, olives, and roasting chestnuts. The chatter is deafening, vendors shout prices, donkeys bray, and somewhere a flute squeaks off-key. Amidst this chaos stretches one of the strangest corners of commerce, the slave market. Wooden platforms stand ready, ropes tied to posts, and men with wax tablets haggle over human lives as casually as over sacks of grain. You edge closer, watching as one boy is paraded for sale, a placard around his neck listing his skills: good cook, understands Greek, no debts. The placard is important because, in Rome, not every sale was straightforward. Believe it or not, masters couldn't simply sell slaves however they liked. Laws placed restrictions on what counted as a legal transaction. The mainstream fact: Roman law required sellers to disclose certain defects in slaves. If someone had epilepsy, a history of running away, or even a bad temper, the seller was supposed to reveal it. Failing to do so could lead to lawsuits. Yes, you could sue your neighbor for selling you a faulty slave. Imagine ancient Yelp reviews: 1 star, this guy promised a good scribe, but the fellow keeps doodling gladiators in the margins. And here comes a quirky tidbit: in some markets, especially in Delos, slaves were sorted by type like cattle. Those with education, secretaries, tutors, accountants, went for sky-high prices, while field hands fetched less. But Roman buyers sometimes faced restrictions on where they could sell next. Certain provinces forbade exporting skilled slaves, fearing brain drain before brain drain was even a phrase. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were widely enforced or more like polite guidelines. Some evidence suggests crafty traders ignored the rules, disguising epileptics as healthy or passing off fugitives as new arrivals. Others claim the courts genuinely cracked down, at least in high-profile cases. The truth probably lies somewhere between: plenty of fraud, but enough lawsuits to keep everyone nervous. You linger near one seller who's trying to unload a slave clearly terrified of chains. The man swears up and down that the boy is obedient, never runs. A sharp-eyed buyer scoffs, points to scars on the boy's ankles, and threatens to take him to court if the lie continues. It's a tense moment, one that reveals how even in the slave market, this theater of human suffering, owners couldn't simply do whatever they pleased. Another layer of restriction appeared in contracts. Some owners freed slaves under the condition that they not be resold into particularly harsh work, like the mines. If another master ignored that clause, legal trouble brewed. Again, it wasn't about kindness, it was about contracts and Roman obsession with legal order. You walk away from the platforms, ears ringing from haggling, and notice how strangely bureaucratic the whole process feels. The empire had no problem with treating humans as property, but it did have a problem with bad paperwork. Rules about fraud, disclosure, and resale were little fences around the cruelty, like thin reeds along a riverbank. They didn't stop the current, but they shaped its flow, and as the sun sets, casting long shadows across the forum, you realize the irony. In Rome, you could own a human being, but you couldn't lie about whether that human being had epilepsy. Property rights, yes. Unlimited freedom to deceive, no. For all its brutality, even slavery in Rome came with receipts. You wake to the sound of footsteps in the villa courtyard, the measured stomp of a household guard, the rustle of servants hauling water, the high-pitched laughter of children darting between columns. Today, you've been told, will be different. You won't linger in the markets or sneak through alleys. Instead, you're invited into the quiet, inner world of a Roman domus, where slaves lived side by side with their masters, yet in spaces carefully carved out by walls, thresholds, and invisible boundaries of rank. The atrium gleams with polished marble, sunlight streaming down through the open roof onto the household shrine. Here, the family's ancestors are honored with wax masks, and slaves are expected to bow each morning. Their gestures part of the home's rhythm. But behind this grandeur lies the hidden heart of the household, the slave quarters. Some were tucked away in tiny, airless rooms near the kitchen or stables. You follow a narrow corridor and see one now, a space hardly larger than a modern pantry, packed with straw mats, oil lamps, and little else. Privacy? Non-existent. Comfort? Barely. And yet, these rooms pulsed with whispered conversations, tired laughter, and the slow weaving of friendships that helped ease long nights. Mainstream fact: not all households treated slaves the same way. Wealthy senators might own dozens, even hundreds, arranging them into specialized groups: cooks, tutors, scribes, hairdressers, bodyguards. A small family, on the other hand, might rely on just one or two slaves, who lived and worked so closely with their masters that boundaries blurred. In some cases, those slaves even joined meals, not at the triclinium couches of course, but perched on stools at the edge of the room, ever ready to serve. Here comes a curious detail: in certain households, slaves could actually be ranked against one another. Some bore titles like dispensator, accountant, or atriensis, house steward, giving them authority over fellow slaves. Archaeologists have uncovered graffiti where one slave mocks another for being a donkey who obeys a donkey. Rivalries flared. Power trickled down even here, in the lowest rungs of society. Your steps carry you into the bustling kitchen, where smoke stings your eyes and the air is heavy with garlic and fish sauce. A cook stirs a pot of lentils, snapping at an assistant who drops a ladle. Their work never ends, yet there's something oddly steady in the rhythm: chopping, stirring, carrying trays to the dining room. Food bound the household together, and those who prepared it often knew more secrets than anyone else. After all, they overheard conversations, read half-discarded notes, and sometimes even had the power to poison, though history tells us those moments were rare, and the fear of them perhaps greater than the reality. Debate among historians lingers here too: were slave quarters always so cramped and grim? Some argue that in wealthy households, conditions could be better. Slaves might receive clothing, regular meals, and even the chance to save money toward eventual freedom. Others insist that, glamour aside, exploitation remained exploitation, and those comforts only highlighted the gulf between slave and master. Evening falls. Lamps flicker in the peristyle garden, and the family retreats indoors. Slaves shuffle back to their corners, some collapsing into straw. Others sneaking sips of leftover wine, whispering plans or dreams of freedom. The walls seem to close in, muffling their voices, yet the villa hums with life, layers of dependence and hierarchy stacked together under one roof. As you drift toward sleep in this imagined room, the thought lingers: in ancient Rome, a household wasn't just family. It was a web of power, obligation, and invisible labor. To live here meant inhabiting both the glittering world of marble halls and the shadowy world of straw-stuffed corners, two halves of the same whole. The city breathes differently when you step outside the villa. You join the trickle of slaves making their way to the streets, carrying baskets, scrolls, or messages. Some look hurried, others resigned, but all of them are woven into Rome's daily rhythms, invisible yet indispensable. The cobblestones under your sandals are uneven, worn smooth by thousands of feet, and every corner tells you how much the city leaned on this hidden workforce. In the bustling forum, you see them everywhere, slaves sweeping marble steps, balancing amphorae of wine, fetching water from fountains, and trailing behind their masters like shadows. A senator debates with a rival, and behind him, two scribes stand with wax tablets ready. They don't speak unless commanded, but their eyes flick back and forth, catching every word. Mainstream fact: slaves often acted as secretaries, accountants, and even managers of their masters' estates. Entire fortunes could depend on the accuracy of a slave's numbers scratched into wax, but not all errands were so refined. A delivery slave trudges past you with a heavy cart of firewood, his tunic streaked with sweat. Another shouts at a stubborn mule that refuses to budge, earning jeers from passing children. Some slaves worked so publicly that their tasks blurred with those of free poor Romans. How could you tell the difference, unless you caught a glance of a collar around the neck? And yes, that's your quirky tidbit of the day. In certain cases, slaves were forced to wear iron collars inscribed with words like "If found, return me to my master." Imagine living as both a human and a walking lost and found notice. The smells of the city sharpen, bread baking in street ovens, sewage running through channels, incense curling from temples. Slaves carried messages between homes, darting through alleys faster than modern couriers. You trail one into a bathhouse, where he delivers a bundle of oil and towels for his master. The bathhouse itself buzzes with conversation, steam clouding the air, and once again, the slaves hover, standing ready with strigils, scraping sweat and grime from backs, holding out towels, fetching gossip as much as they fetch soap. There's a strange paradox here. While slaves were everywhere, their voices remain faint in the written record. Historians still argue whether we underestimate how much agency they carved out in these public roles. Did errands give them tiny slices of freedom, brief moments out of the household eye, or were they only more visible, easier to control? The debate keeps circling, because scraps of evidence point both ways. You follow the river Tiber, where dockworkers shout over crates and the slap of waves against wooden hulls. The slaves here are strong, shoulders straining as they haul amphorae of olive oil from Spain or sacks of grain from Egypt. Without them, the city of Rome, with its million hungry mouths, would collapse in days. The scale is dizzying, and you realize that slaves weren't just hidden servants, they were the engine of Rome's survival. At dusk, the city softens. Shops close, voices fade, torches flare along the streets. Slaves retreat home, or rather, to whatever corners they are allowed to collapse in. Some share cramped rooms in the back of shops, others curl up in stables beside animals. A few, those running errands for kind masters, sneak in a little pleasure, a gulp of street food. A chat with another slave, a brief flirtation in the crowd. You, standing here under the fading Roman sky, realize that public life for a slave meant being everywhere and nowhere, visible to all, yet never fully seen. They walked the same streets you do, heard the same speeches, smelled the same roasting bread. But for them, every step was work, every glance from a free Roman a reminder of their place. The city never sleeps, and neither do its countless shadows. Tomorrow, the errands will start again. The clang of metal echoes in your ears as you wander toward the heart of Rome's muscle, the workshops. If villas and forums were the stages of slave life, these workshops were the grinding gears that kept the empire turning. The air here is thick with soot and the hiss of molten bronze. A blacksmith's hammer strikes an anvil in relentless rhythm, sparks flying into the dim corners where apprentices, many of them slaves, scramble to fetch tongs or cool blades in troughs of water. you lean closer and feel the heat wash your face, imagining long hours spent at the forge. Mainstream fact: Roman industry depended heavily on slave labor. From textiles to pottery to construction, slaves were the backbone of production. They built aqueducts stone by stone, carved amphitheaters like the Colosseum, and kept an endless stream of bricks and tiles flowing into the city. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it left fingerprints across centuries. Move into a dye workshop, and the smell hits you before the colors do, sharp, fishy, eye-watering. Purple dye, made from murex snails, was so precious that workers needed thousands of shells to stain even a small scrap of cloth. Slaves hunched over vats, hands stained permanently, their backs aching from the endless stirring. Quirky tidbit: some textile slaves had hands dyed so deeply that people joked you could tell their profession without asking. Imagine trying to shake hands politely when your palm glowed purple forever. But not all workshops were cruel pits. In some, skilled slaves could achieve a strange kind of respect. A potter's assistant who shaped amphorae perfectly might be praised, even rewarded with food or clothing. Occasionally, masters even allowed skilled artisans to keep a fraction of their earnings, planting the tiniest seed of hope for manumission. Historians still argue whether these incentives were genuine kindness or simply shrewd economics, a way to squeeze more productivity from weary hands. The noise carries you to a carpentry shop, where sawdust floats in the air like snow. Wooden beams become furniture, chests, and shutters under the blades of slaves who've mastered their craft. The smell is almost comforting: pine, oak, resin, but the rhythm is punishing. Tools clang, orders bark, sweat pours. You rub your own palms and imagine the blisters, and then there are the building sites. Picture it: scaffolding scraping the sky, slaves hauling stones up ramps, voices echoing off half-finished arches. A foreman shouts, his whip snapping the air, not always striking flesh, but always threatening. The Colosseum itself rose this way, thousands of nameless laborers straining their muscles day after day. A single block could weigh as much as a modern car. You pause, craning your neck toward the imagined height, and think, how many backs did it take to raise such glory? Evenings in workshops weren't quiet retreats. Slaves often slept right where they worked, rolled in cloaks beside furnaces or kilns. Some stole moments of laughter, carving graffiti into walls, tiny sketches of gladiators, animals, or mocking portraits of their masters. These scratches remind you that even in exhaustion, humor flickered. As night falls, you watch a blacksmith bank the forge, the glow dimming like a fading heartbeat. The slaves collapse in heaps, soot streaking their faces, calluses cracking on their hands. Tomorrow, the rhythm will start again, metal clanging, dye vats boiling, sawdust rising. Rome's glory rests not on marble alone but on the sweat-stained labor of men and women who had no choice in the matter. You step away, ears still ringing with hammers. The empire's greatness shines brightest in its monuments, but in every brick and every beam, the shadows of unseen hands remain. Dawn creeps over the Palatine Hill, painting the horizon with pale streaks of gold and violet, and you find yourself among a group of slaves gathering for a duty unlike the others you've witnessed: military service. Yes, military. The thought unsettles you. The city stirs awake behind you, but here at the edge of Rome, the clatter of arms and the murmur of orders rise above birdsong. While Rome's legions were largely composed of free citizens, history reveals that slaves sometimes found themselves pressed into auxiliary roles, especially in moments of crisis or on private estates where defense was demanded. The morning air is sharp with dew, damp against your skin, mingling with the heavy musk of horses and the acrid tang of oiled leather. You trudge alongside them, watching the surreal procession of men legally deemed property now entrusted with weapons of war. Mainstream fact: during certain periods of strain, slaves were recruited to fight in wars, serve as camp followers, or man fortifications. The famous gladiators themselves, trained fighters for spectacle, were sometimes thrust into real combat if circumstances required. Some carried armor, shields, and swords under the authority of their masters or local magistrates. It is a bizarre inversion. Those denied even the dignity of free will are entrusted with instruments of death. Each clanking blade is a paradox, a reminder of both the master's authority and the empire's occasional desperation. A quirky tidbit lingers in your mind. The historian Appian describes how, during the Social War, 91 to 88 BCE, a group of slaves were temporarily armed to defend towns. They fought with such unexpected skill that locals called them the Iron Shadows. The nickname was half admiration, half dread, praising their courage while secretly fearing the day these shadows might rise against the city that armed them. Imagine the dissonance: unfree men, lauded in whispers for valor, yet never permitted to own that honor. The title clung to them like smoke, proof that respect and terror often walked side by side. Historians still debate what such service meant. Did military duty elevate their status, even briefly, or did it only heighten their risks? Some records hint at temporary privileges, a coin or two, lighter rations of labor, perhaps a cloak of recognition. But these rewards were fragile, fleeting, and most remained legally enslaved, thrust into mortal danger without the protections granted to soldiers. It is a moral gray area stretched taut: freedom and ownership, survival and obedience, each blurring into the other. As you follow the group toward the training grounds, the contradictions become sharper. Masters could order their slaves into battle, yes, but even authority had boundaries. Some laws prohibited sending a slave on particularly hazardous campaigns without oversight, though what counted as hazardous was flexible, often twisted to the master's convenience. Imperial decrees clarified that if a slave died in service, compensation, acknowledgement of loss, was owed not to the fallen man, but to the master who had lost property. Even in life and death, ownership was the measure. On the packed dirt of the field, you watch slaves spar with wooden swords. At first, the practice is clumsy, blades held too high, stances wide and unsteady. But gradually, their movements sharpen. Sweat beads along their temples, sliding down sun-browned faces. A centurion stands nearby, arms crossed, eyes sharp as a hawk's. He interrupts occasionally, striking a shoulder or wrist to adjust form, his voice clipped and emotionless. His expression betrays nothing: no contempt, no encouragement, only the cool assessment of a man drilling tools into shape. The slaves whisper to one another when he turns his back, short bursts of strategy, corrections, hints of shared rebellion in tone if not in act. Outwardly, they remain obedient; inwardly, they test the small freedoms that words allow. By midday, the training breaks. Dust clings to their skin, their tunics damp with sweat. You follow a few of them down to the riverbank, where they strip off belts and splash water over grime-streaked bodies. The sun glints on rippling water, momentarily softening the harshness of their condition. For a moment, you could almost forget the weight of chains that binds them to service. Almost. Yet as they rinse armor, scrub leather, and sharpen blades with quiet diligence, the tension reasserts itself. Each gesture is a reminder: survival here depends on skill and obedience, but trust remains scarce. The afternoon wanes into evening, and faint drums roll from the city, echoing across the hills like a heartbeat. The slaves file back toward their quarters in silence, steps heavy but shoulders squared with a subtle strength. Military service grants them skills, discipline, and fleeting bonds of camaraderie, but none of it cuts through the iron truth of their status. Even with swords in hand, they remain property first, human second. As twilight cloaks the city, a strange quiet settles. You realize how deeply the empire's need for manpower bent the rules, permitting paradoxes where slaves could march as soldiers, yet never claim the dignity of being one. Life offered them moments of authority, snatches of respect, and tastes of danger, but freedom remained always beyond their reach. In these circumstances, survival demanded its own form of strategy, balancing obedience with skill, mastering discipline without forgetting the chains, and learning always that the sword in hand did not make them masters of their fate. You follow the echoes of the city toward the Circus Maximus, the heart of spectacle in Rome. The noise swells long before the building itself comes into view, a rolling tide of cheers and gasps that funnels through arches and colonnades. The closer you walk, the more overwhelming it becomes, horses thundering past in a blur of hooves and leather harnesses, chariots scraping the dirt track with metallic shrieks, and the warm air thick with a mixture of sweat, hay, dust, and the faint tang of wine spilled from cheering spectators. It is chaotic, exhilarating, and deadly all at once. Here, slaves occupy roles that teeter uneasily between servitude and spectacle. Some serve quietly in the shadows as grooms, trainers, or stable hands, while others are forced into the center of the arena itself, thrown into the terrifying world of chariot racing or staged combat where survival depends on speed, strength, and luck. Mainstream fact: slaves frequently manned the public games, their unseen labor forming the hidden machinery that kept the spectacles running. They handled the animals, erected temporary structures, managed props for mock battles, and in many cases, stepped directly into danger. A stumble, a poorly tied harness, or a frightened horse could mean serious injury, or worse, death. Yet even in this environment of risk, there were legal frameworks. Masters could not simply execute a slave for a mistake in the arena. The wrath of the crowd, as well as Rome's own legal codes, imposed limits. To kill a slave before tens of thousands of witnesses without justification risked scandal, financial ruin, or even censure. Thus a strange mixture arose, absolute authority tethered by public visibility. The arena amplified scrutiny, making cruelty dangerous when performed in the open. A quirky tidbit emerges from the sources: some circus slaves were dressed in colorful tunics and given whimsical nicknames, a bizarre attempt to transform anonymity into entertainment. Names like Little Thunder, Sandstorm, or the Iron Hoof echoed in the stands, shouted by spectators who saw only a performance, not a person. One historian notes how such monikers created a thin illusion of camaraderie, as if a catchy label could offset the reality of bondage. You cannot help but picture the absurdity: cheering crowds, betting on outcomes, laughing at a name, while forgetting that the figure at the center of the roar is someone legally classified as property. Historians still argue whether the rules at public games were truly effective or largely symbolic. Some claim masters respected the limits out of fear of scandal, of losing face, of being fined or shamed. Others insist the regulations, though imperfect, did provide genuine checks, preventing the worst abuses under the watchful gaze of thousands. Either way, the boundaries existed, invisible rails that kept cruelty contained just enough to preserve the appearance of order. You wander past the stables, where the atmosphere shifts from frenzy to tense industriousness. The stalls are carefully arranged, each animal worth a fortune in racing or ceremonial value. Slaves move with brisk precision, grooming manes, refilling water troughs, piling hay into neat stacks. The work is relentless and heavily policed. Mistreat a horse, fail to secure a harness, or fall short in cleaning, and punishment comes swiftly. Yet the eyes of the public mean that punishment, too, must be measured. Here necessity tempers cruelty, a strange balance of care and control where animals are treated almost more preciously than the humans tending them. Then your attention is drawn to a side yard where a small group of gladiators trains behind high wooden fences. They are not all prisoners of war or condemned criminals, some are slaves purchased outright for combat, investments in both blood and spectacle. Their owners gamble on their strength, hoping they will survive long enough to gain renown and fatten purses with prize money. For them, the rules are equally strange. An owner could not casually execute a gladiator in training, at least not without authorization from the lanista, trainer, or the magistrate overseeing the games. The empire demanded procedure, even in blood sport. Thus, gladiators lived inside a paradoxical safety net, their lives valued not for their humanity but for their potential profit and entertainment. The afternoon sun tilts westward, casting long shadows across the arena. The stands begin to empty, the air no longer vibrating with the same intensity. Dust lingers in the air, glowing orange in the fading light, while the rhythmic sweep of slaves' brooms tries to erase the traces of the day's violence. Behind fences and stables, the workers slip back into obscurity. They are everywhere and nowhere at once, essential to the show, yet invisible once the spectacle ends. Evening gathers. Horses whinny as they are led to rest, carts rattle over cobblestones, and you drift alongside the slaves heading back to their quarters. The spectacle may have concluded, but their labor continues quietly in the margins, feeding animals, scrubbing harnesses, stacking benches, preparing for tomorrow's roar. The limitations on cruelty here, inconsistent as they are, remind you that Rome's power, so often unchecked, was not absolute. Visibility forced restraint. Tens of thousands of eyes meant that even in the most violent public arenas, power had to bend, if only slightly, to the weight of scrutiny. As twilight settles over the Circus Maximus, the city itself seems to exhale. The stands stand empty, the dust settles, and shadows stretch across the track. You carry with you the strange rhythm of what you have seen, danger yoked to entertainment, servitude dressed in color, authority checked only by spectacle. It is Rome in miniature, a world of control, risk, and regulation, all woven into the thunder of hooves and the fading roar of the crowd. Night falls and you make your way to the harbor, where salt tangs the air and the low murmur of waves mingles with the clatter of shipyards. Slaves work here tirelessly, loading amphorae of wine, sacks of grain, and crates of olive oil onto massive cargo vessels bound for distant provinces. Their bodies are slick with sweat, their voices hoarse from shouting over wind and water. Yet even in this chaotic labor, rules linger, limits on what a master can demand, subtle protections woven into the fabric of maritime life. Mainstream fact, Roman law included restrictions on maritime slave labor, especially regarding exposure to danger. Owners couldn't simply force slaves onto doomed vessels without consequence. While accidents happened, and many lives were lost, the state occasionally intervened when negligence or abuse became egregious. There was a recognition that slaves, like cargo, had value. Unlike barrels of grain, they were living property, and reckless treatment could trigger financial or legal repercussions. Quirky tidbit: some slaves were trained as divers, plummeting into murky harbors to recover lost cargo or anchor chains. Historical accounts describe them wearing lead belts and simple goggles fashioned from polished bronze or glass. The work was dangerous, yet highly prized, and these underwater slaves gained notoriety for feats that would inspire both awe and anxiety among spectators. Imagine holding your breath underwater, knowing a single misstep could be fatal, while your master's ledger literally counts your life as a line item. Historians still argue whether these legal protections genuinely improved safety or were mainly symbolic. Many suggest that enforcement was inconsistent, heavily dependent on the master's wealth and influence, leaving most maritime slaves exposed to extreme hazards regardless of the law. The debate persists, whispering like waves against stone. You walk along the docks, noticing the carefully marked chains used to secure cargo and the slatted ramps that guide slaves and beasts alike. Masters oversaw every move, but they were not permitted unlimited cruelty. For instance, a ship's captain could not arbitrarily punish slaves with prolonged exposure to the sun or drowning exercises. Some legal texts even mention fines for unnecessary abuse during loading or unloading. These rules, while sometimes ignored, hint at a recognition that mistreatment carried costs beyond the moral, financial, and reputational. As night deepens, lanterns flicker along the quay. A slave rests against a crate, inhaling briny air, listening to gulls calling overhead. He knows the limits imposed by law, yet he also knows that obedience is mandatory and scrutiny selective. The harbor is a theater of power and tension. Every task, every dropped amphora, every shouted order reflects the fragile balance between authority and regulation. Even the logistics of sleep reveal boundaries. Slaves often slept near the docks in temporary shelters, sometimes aboard the very ships they labored on. Owners were expected to provide minimal safety and food, yet the quality varied widely. The law stepped in sporadically to curb extreme neglect, but otherwise, survival often depended on cunning, endurance, and cooperation among slaves. You watch the moon reflect across the water, imagining the distant ports these ships will reach, carrying slaves and goods alike. The limits on masters' authority, though inconsistently enforced, created subtle patterns, guidelines, guardrails, and occasional safety nets that shaped everyday life. Even in the perilous, endless labor of the harbor, rules existed. Sometimes they saved lives, sometimes they barely scratched the surface of cruelty, but they were there, quietly tempering absolute power. The harbor exhales, and you realize that Rome, for all its brutality, maintained boundaries, not from compassion, but from necessity, order, and the ever-present whisper of public and legal scrutiny. Here, by the water's edge, you glimpse the tension that defines slavery: dominance measured, danger managed, lives bounded. You trudge into a quieter district now, where the smell of bread drifts from early morning ovens and the first light paints terracotta rooftops gold. Here, slaves perform subtler work, scribes copying manuscripts, teachers guiding children, and household servants attending to elderly masters. Their tasks are less physically punishing than in the fields or docks, but the rules governing their behavior are just as complex. Even in offices and villas, limits existed. A master could not arbitrarily harm or degrade a slave in front of clients or visiting dignitaries. Appearances mattered, and the law occasionally intervened if boundaries were crossed. Mainstream fact: legal texts from the imperial period reference cases where masters were penalized for mistreating slaves during work that brought them into contact with the public. The underlying principle was not compassion per se, but social order. Rome relied on these slaves to maintain a functional society, and excessive cruelty threatened that order. The system was pragmatic, not moral. A quirky tidbit: some scribes were known to sneak tiny doodles or sarcastic notes into official documents, like hidden graffiti for future generations. Imagine a ledger detailing grain deliveries, with a marginal sketch of a horse wearing a toga. Such subversive humor offered a secret respite, a private rebellion within a rigid hierarchy. Historians still argue whether these small acts were widespread or merely anecdotal, but they remind us that even under scrutiny, slaves found subtle ways to assert identity. You follow a tutor through a villa library, noticing the scrolls stacked in tight rows. Each movement must be careful: a slip, a torn scroll, and the consequences fall on the slave. The master may scold, reprimand, or fine, though execution or severe corporal punishment was now largely prohibited in these professional settings. Boundaries were codified. The risk of public scandal or legal complaint constrained unchecked authority. Some slaves functioned as messengers between households, carrying sensitive correspondence. Here, too, limits applied. They could be punished for negligence, but not arbitrarily killed for losing a letter. Their role demanded trust, yet the constant reminder of ownership lingered. One misstep could result in relocation, sale, or harsh reprimand, but the absolute power of the master was checked by law and social expectation. Even domestic spaces offered odd paradoxes. Slaves often shared intimate access to their masters' lives, preparing meals, dressing them, bathing children. Yet they remained legally invisible in decisions that affected them most. Historians still debate how much agency such access actually afforded. Did being inside the household provide leverage or merely intensify the pressure of surveillance? The evidence hints at both, leaving room for imagination. As night falls over the district, you observe the subtle rhythms of these less visible labors. Slaves return scrolls to shelves, oil lamps burn low, and quiet conversations flit through hallways. Their lives, though bounded, are punctuated by moments of small autonomy, secret humor, and skillful maneuvering within rules that simultaneously limit and protect. Even in the calmest spaces, boundaries exist, shaping lives in ways both protective and oppressive. You pause, imagining the faint glow of candlelight on parchment, and realize the law's limits on cruelty weren't always dramatic or life-saving in an immediate sense. Sometimes they were subtle, embedded in etiquette, expectations, and public perception. But those subtle rules mattered. They structured daily life, offering minor reprieves and glimpses of agency in a world designed to control. You wander into the quieter outskirts of Rome, where gardens and olive groves stretch beyond crowded streets, and the scent of wild herbs mingles with dust and sunlight. Here, slaves toil in less visible ways, tending orchards, pruning vines, caring for livestock. The work is backbreaking, yes, but unlike the public arenas or bustling markets, it carries a different rhythm, one that reflects subtle limitations on the authority of their masters. Even in the open fields, there were lines that could not be crossed, drawn not by empathy, but by law, custom, and social expectation. Mainstream fact: Roman law prohibited extreme cruelty in these agricultural settings. Masters could not kill, maim, or punish excessively while tending to routine tasks, especially for long-term laborers. The property itself, the slave, was valuable, and destroying that value through brutality was considered both wasteful and, occasionally, illegal. Owners learned quickly that restrained violence protected the efficiency and stability of the workforce. A quirky tidbit: some estates employed musical motivation. Slaves working the fields would sometimes hum, whistle, or play simple instruments while laboring. Farmers discovered that rhythmic noise improved productivity, whether or not the law explicitly endorsed it. You can picture a row of tired slaves moving in harmony to makeshift melodies. Fingers stained with soil, voices breaking through the heat of the day. Historians still argue whether these limits truly softened life or merely structured it. Some contend that laws prevented the worst abuses, while others suggest masters found ways to circumvent restrictions without overtly breaking them. The debate lingers because evidence is patchy and often filtered through elite perspectives. You pause by an olive tree, watching a slave carefully pluck fruit while another tends goats nearby. Even here, there were social rules. Public displays of humiliation were discouraged, and neighbors could intervene if cruelty exceeded expected norms. The legal limits weren't about kindness, they were about control, property value, and maintaining order within the community. Occasionally, slaves in these rural domains could cultivate personal gardens, trade small goods among themselves, or engage in minor entrepreneurial activity with their master's approval. These tiny freedoms existed within a cage, but they mattered. In such moments, slaves experienced agency, however constrained, and glimpsed the possibility of life outside pure labor. As the sun dips low, painting the fields gold, you notice how these limits, sparse and uneven though they were, offered more than mere protection. They created predictable boundaries, allowing slaves to plan, to resist in subtle ways, and occasionally to negotiate their small comforts. Life remained harsh, yet within those boundaries, humans found the room to breathe. The day ends, shadows stretching long over the olive groves. You feel the rhythm of labor, the weight of rules, the strange balance between ownership and limitation. Across Rome, from city streets to rural estates, the legal and social frameworks contained cruelty, never eliminated it. Slaves lived in a world of measured violence and bounded authority, finding in those margins the faintest glimmers of autonomy, humor, and endurance. The sun sinks behind Rome, and you walk slowly along empty streets, the city exhaling in warm evening air. The sounds soften, a stray dog padding over cobbles, the distant murmur of a fountain, the gentle clink of pottery from a last-tending kitchen. You notice how shadows stretch across walls, carrying memories of the day's labor, the quiet rules that held even the harshest authority in check. Slaves, countless and varied, move through your imagination, their lives traced in routines, whispers, and fleeting joys. Some stumble, some laugh, some endure the weight of tasks that stretch into exhaustion. Yet through every alley, villa, and field, the subtle boundaries remain, measures of restraint that, however thin, create space for tiny victories, small rebellions, secret friendships, and moments of self-expression. The city feels almost peaceful now. You imagine the glow of lamps in distant courtyards, the soft murmur of water in fountains, and the steady rhythm of those tasked with labor, moving in cycles older than memory. The world of Rome, complex and often cruel, carried threads of structure that made life navigable. Even survivable, for those bound by chains and ownership. Let your thoughts drift with the shadows of the day. Remember that in every task, in every command, in every whispered joke or secret drawing, the human spirit endured. Even where cruelty existed, the law, custom, and public expectation imposed boundaries that could be relied upon, however inconsistently. Within those margins, life found space, even if just enough to breathe, to hope, and to persist. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Feel the weight of history soften around you, the lessons of resilience and subtle resistance folding into your thoughts. Let sleep carry you gently through the echoes of Rome, and allow your mind to rest, knowing that even in a harsh world, there were lines drawn and breaths taken, and endurance shaped every life.